right. Good afternoon, everyone. No Matt Lee today. Who wants to go first?
I'll go.
Leon. A lot of people auditioning for the role of Matt Lee. Let the record reflect a snicker from the front row.
I know you talked about this already yesterday, but I'd like to come back to it because it's a little bit mind-boggling to me. Since when is a UN resolution, a Security Council UN non-binding? Because that's a significant shift. That's not the understanding of most countries, and it's not the understanding of the UN either. This is not a Chapter 7 resolution, so I don't get how the US is now saying that it would be non-binding and basically giving the message that another country wouldn't necessarily need to comply with it.
So let me explain what we meant by that. First of all, as we said yesterday, and we made clear all along, we have always believed that the path to a ceasefire and the release of hostages is something that will be reached through negotiations between Israel and Hamas, enabled by third-party countries, and in which the United States is participating, and not through a UN process, and that remains our belief. Nevertheless, when we say the resolution is non-binding, what we mean is that it does not impose any new obligations on the parties, the way, for example, some UN resolutions that impose obligatory sanctions, impose actual requirements on people to implement them. That said, we do believe that even though there are this resolution lacks non-binding new requirements that it is imposed on the parties, it does carry weight, and it is something that should be implemented.
I mean, that's a little bit contradictory, if I may. I mean, either it's binding or it's non-binding. If it's non-binding, like you said, because it lacks provisions, why would anybody comply with it? It's
non-binding in that it does not impose any new obligations on the parties, but we do believe it should be respected, that it carries weight, and that it should be implemented, as has always been the case, as always been our belief when it comes to UN Security Council resolutions. Sure.
Okay. So, if this was non-binding, now the other resolutions, the three resolutions that you vetoed, were they also in the same kind of resolution?
So, Saeed, I'd have to go back and look at the provisions of those, but we vetoed them. So ultimately, they weren't the voice of the UN Security Council.
I'm saying if they are not binding, then why bother and veto it?
Because they carry weight and should be implemented, and so we want to see resolutions that pass ultimately reflect the policy positions of the United States, which is what I said yesterday. We came to the determination that this Security Council resolution, although it did contain, or it lacked some provisions that we wanted to see, most notably condemning Hamas's actions on it called for two things that we support, a ceasefire and the release of hostages together. And so that's why we abstained from the resolution. We do believe that it carries weight and should be implemented.
Mm-hmm. But you know, and I remember like during the whole Iraq thing, there were 12 UN resolutions, and they were all binding. They were all binding every time, and the U.S. would be the first one to say it's binding. I mean, I worked in Iraq. I know exactly what was going on. So I'm saying that any UN resolution that passes, that is allowed to pass, is potentially can be utilized within the framework of Chapter 7.
Is there a question there,
Yes,
Saeed?
it is. I'm asking you. I mean, can you answer?
No, it's just there was a statement. I want to see if there's actually a question.
So, okay, let me reframe my question. Do you think that this
one.
resolution can potentially be subject to Chapter 7?
We believe that the UN Security Council resolution carries weight and should be respected, as I said.
Okay. I have a couple of other questions, but I'll defer to others.
There are some reports that Israelis feel that their ability to depend on the United States has now decreased because of the abstention that the Security Council vote yesterday. Can you just speak to that and the relationship right now?
So absolutely not. First of all, the relationship between the United States and Israel is one that is longstanding. They are a longstanding ally of the United States, and the president has made clear that the United States will always support Israel's right to defend itself. That was true before our action in the Security Council yesterday. It remains true today. As I said yesterday, the position that we take, and the position that was contained in that resolution that led us to not block its moving forward, is that there should be a ceasefire and there should be the release of hostages. That is our position. We have believed it has been Israel's position because Israel has been negotiating to try to achieve a ceasefire that would secure the release of hostages. So far from there being, at least in our eyes, any distance between the United States and Israel, we believe the position that we were endorsing at the United Nations yesterday is the same one that Israel has been trying to achieve through the ongoing negotiations. Now, none of that is to say there are not things with which we disagree with Israel. There obviously are. There have been a number of things in recent months where we have had disagreements with them, and we did with them in our conversations about those disagreements, and those, of course, have been well aired in public at this podium and in other places.
And Netanyahu's office is indicating that the U.S. not vetoing the resolution actually hampered or harmed the hostage talks. Is that the U.S. understanding?
So that statement, which I believe said that Hamas pulled out of the hostage talks, or Hamas rejected the most recent proposal because of the United Nations Security Council resolution, that statement is inaccurate in almost every respect, and it is unfair to the hostages and their families. The description of Hamas's response that has been aired in the public is all from news reports. It's not the actual substance of the response, and I can tell you that that response was prepared before the UN Security Council vote, not after it. So for the United States, we are not going to engage in rhetorical distractions on this issue. We are going to continue to work to try to bring the hostages home.
Just one last question on this. I understand that U.S. officials say that there are domestic political concerns for Prime Minister Netanyahu when he went forward with these Rafah meetings here in the United States. But it does have a damaging effect on the U.S.-Israel relationship as well. And now he's going even further and saying that this move is harming hostage, talks. Are there going to be ramifications for Israel for pulling back on these talks and for now, blaming the U.S. for hostage talks not moving forward quickly enough?
So I wouldn't look at it the way I wouldn't look at the question of ramifications in the way that you pose the question. We're not going to make our decisions based on minor disagreements or whether someone canceled a meeting or not. We're going to make our decisions based on what we believe is in the best national security interests of the United States. And ultimately, when we have conversations with Israel, we are talking about what we believe are in the national security interests of Israel, as well in the national security interests of the region and in the interests of the Palestinian people and others. So when you think about ramifications, we wanted to have that meeting with Israel to present to them an alternative way to accomplish their legitimate security goals of defeating the Hamas battalions in Rafah, because we believe it is in their interest to do this in a better way. We believe that a free operation in Rafah will not just cause civilian harm to the Palestinian people. It will not just hinder the flow of humanitarian assistance, most of which is coming in through the Rafah area and being distributed initially through Rafah. We believe that that kind of operation would hurt Israel's national security. It will leave Israel more isolated in the world. It will separate Israel from countries that have been longtime partners of Israel. And you've heard this from countries all around the world. So we have been making clear that this kind of operation is not in Israel's interest, let alone in the interest of the Palestinian people. So when you speak to ramifications, those are the type of ramifications that we're worried about for Israel, and that's why we wanted to have this meeting to present to them what we think is a better alternative.
Are you rescheduling those meetings anytime soon?
I don't have any announcements to make regarding schedules.
Just to clarify, what does it mean to say that it should be the resolution should be implemented? From the Israeli point of view, I guess they would say there's no deal to be taken at the moment. So, how can they implement?
First point I made, which is that we believe a ceasefire and the release of hostages will be ultimately secured through negotiations, and it's the negotiations that we have been pursuing in the region, most recently over the weekend in Doha. And so we are going to continue to pursue those negotiations to reach a ceasefire and secure the release of all hostages.
Sure. I wonder if we can just talk about the meeting with the defense minister yesterday. The Israeli defense minister, did he come with specific requests in terms of more arms that Israel wants the US to provide for the continued operation in Gaza?
So I'm not going to speak specifically to that, other than to say that, as you would expect, whenever we have a conversation with the defense minister, they usually have things that they want from the United States. And I know that he's having meetings at the Pentagon today. He also met at the White House yesterday. From our perspective, and I will let the defense minister speak for himself. From our perspective, we were there to continue the conversation that the secretary had in Tel Aviv last week with the Security Cabinet, which included Defense Minister Gallant, about what we thought would be the harm of a full-scale military operation in Rafah, and more things we think Israel needs to do to allow humanitarian assistance in.
So you've got an ally coming, asking for more military support. You've already given quite a lot of military support during this operation, during this conflict, but they're also basically planning to go ahead with an operation that you're telling them is unwise. Are you saying your acceptance of these requests for future arms provisions is going to be conditioned in some way on whether you listen to us on Rafah or not?
Let's take this one step at a time. We believe it's still important to have this conversation. We believe that there is a better way for them to accomplish a legitimate security imperative, and I don't want to preview any possible actions if it goes a different way.
On this,
Go ahead, Michelle.
did you provide the defense minister any guarantees that the U.S. will continue providing Israel with arms?
So the president has spoken to this. He spoke to it recently and said that the United States will always support Israel's right to defend itself. That's not going to change, and I wouldn't want to preview any further steps.
Also,
Leon, go ahead. Leon, go ahead.
Wondering on Rafah, I mean, you've been very clear from the very beginning that you don't dictate policy or operations to Israel. You've said that numerous times. You said you're not involved in the military planning. Here, you're telling them not to do a major offensive in Rafah, but you're giving them or want to talk to them about alternatives, whatever they may be, counterterrorism, what have you, I don't know specifically. But by doing that, you would get directly involved in the operations that were to take place in Rafah, and potentially there could be more civilian deaths and what have you. So in that case, you would be directly involved. How big of a problem is that?
So I don't agree with that. Let me say a few things. Number one, when it comes to dictating, you're right. No, we do not dictate to them. We can't dictate to them. They're a sovereign country, and the United States can't dictate to any sovereign country. They're going to make their own decisions, and they have been quite clear about that, and we would expect nothing less from any sovereign country. That said, our best advice to them, we have done that from the beginning. You've heard the president talk about that when he went to Israel just a week after, or a little over a week after October 7th, where he talked about the fact that because Israel is such a longtime friend, we are going to offer advice about them, oftentimes colored by the mistakes that we have made and the experiences that we have learned from mistakes that we have made in our past and how we have conducted military operations. And so we try.
Very good advice.
And so we try. We try to give them that advice in terms of the options that we will present to them, or that I assume we will present to them at some point. I wouldn't think of it as military planning. We're going to offer them, and I also don't want to preview too much in detail publicly, because these are still conversations that ought to happen privately. But the intent would be to give them advice about how to conduct such operations. It's not to do actual military planning, for example, what to do when, how, with that level of specificity. When I talk about we're not involved in military planning, that's what I mean. We're not in with them planning exact military operations. But we have always offered them advice about what we have believed the best way to go about this operation is. That's true going back to some of the first meetings that we had in Israel right after October 7th.
Well, then either one of two things. Either you gave very bad advice because you have 30,000 civilians who got killed, or they didn't listen to your advice. So what about Rafah? You think they would? Are they actually listening to what you're saying? Because they said, if we don't have the U.S. on board, we're going it alone.
So they will speak for themselves, but we have not yet had the meeting where we outline the steps that they ought to take.
Thank you. I appreciate it. A couple more questions. First of all, the Palestinian Red Cross just announced that Al Amal Hospital in Khan Yunis has been completely shut down. The Israeli army threw out the patient, the staff, and so on, and put dirt, whatever. They closed it off and so on. Are you aware of this?
So I haven't seen that exact report. I've seen reports of operations at hospitals. Hold on, Said. Just let me finish. I've seen reports of operations at hospitals. I haven't seen that specific one, and I know that oftentimes we've gotten, especially over the past few days, conflicting information from Palestinian sources and Israeli sources about exactly what is going to happen. So I'm a little reluctant to make a definitive comment, definitive information. What I will say, two things. Number one, we generally don't want to see operations at hospitals, but number two, we have seen over the past few weeks that areas that had been cleared by Israel, that Hamas fighters have flowed back in and are inside hospitals. And so while we don't want to see operations in hospitals, we also don't believe that Hamas should be hiding there, and we would again encourage them to stop hiding behind patients in hospitals.
Will you look into Al-Amal hospital situation? Okay. Couple of more things. Now, on UNRWA, I know that the largest contributor thus far has been the United States of America, so that's a big chunk, close to $350 million a year, maybe $400 million a year. It's, these operations, not only in Gaza, but they are in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Lebanon, and in Jordan, and in Syria. How do you see this being replaced? Because, obviously nobody's going to shell out that kind of funding. And while the World Food Program and so on can provide food, they cannot replace UNRWA in terms of providing medical care, schools, all kinds of stuff that they do, that they have uniquely done thus far.
So, Said, I think you're referring to, you didn't mention it definitively, but just to make sure I'm clear, you're referring to the provision that the United States Congress passed to ban U.S. funding of UNRWA.
So I have a follow-up on that.
Right, so you're right. The Congress has barred us in this fiscal year and a few months beyond from continuing to fund UNRWA. We do remain committed to the work that UNRWA does. It's important. We also remain committed to providing humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people. I will note that in that appropriations bill that passed that contained that provision, there is somewhere north of $10 billion for humanitarian assistance around the world. That is the pot of money from which we would have drawn to fund UNRWA, and I can tell you that we will draw from that pot of money to fund humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people, and we're exploring what avenues that assistance will take now.
Okay, and my question, to follow up on this one, the President of the United States had, for instance, when they passed the resolution back in '95 that the embassy should be moved to Jerusalem, he had an executive waiver that the President used time every 6 months and so on to keep the embassy in Tel Aviv. Will the President have a similar waiver going?
I think that's a question you should direct to the White House.
Okay, thank you.
Any more on Israel before I go on? Yeah, Ryan, go ahead.
Just on your point about Israel being a sovereign country and the U.S. can't tell them what to do, back in May 19th, 2021, you have Joe Biden telling Netanyahu, his quote was, "Hey man, we are out of runway here. It's over." And it was over. Ronald Reagan famously did the same back in 1982, told him it's over. Why can't he say it's over this time? Does that mean it supports the continuation of this war, even if it means going into Rafah?
So we support Israel's ability to defeat Hamas. We support Israel's legitimate security objectives. We support them ensuring that October 7th can never happen again. And so we continue to support their ability to do that while offering, as I said, our best advice on how to go about that campaign. And that's what we'll continue to do.
What is your assessment on those 2 Hamas battalions that the U.S. has said are so key to take out, and that Israel has said are key to take out? What's the assessment on why Hamas wouldn't be able to just create new battalions? In the absence of a political solution.
Yeah, so it's a great question. First of all, I think it's more than 2. I think it's more than 2 battalions that Israel has said continue to operate in Rafah. So a few things about that. First, in the areas in which it has operated, Israel has in taking out the leadership of some of those Hamas battalions. And while you can replace fighters, ultimately the leaders are harder to replace, or at least takes more time. The initial people who might move up into a leadership role maybe don't have the same experience that those who have been training for some time do. So Israel has been successful in taking out some of the leadership of the Hamas battalions and in taking out fighters, either by killing them on the battlefield or arresting them. So it has degraded Hamas's battalions outside of Rafah, and we believe in a military operation, hopefully in the way that we are suggesting, they could be successful in degrading those battalions in Rafah as well, and that's something that we would support. That said, your underlying question is exactly right. Ultimately, something that we have learned in our counterterrorism experience around the world is that you can, while you can accomplish counterterrorism objectives on the battlefield, ultimately, when it comes to winning the larger battle, you have to offer a political path for the Palestinian people's legitimate, or in this case, you would have to offer. We believe you have to offer a political path for the Palestinian people's legitimate aspirations, and so you have heard the Secretary make very clear that there needs to be a political path forward for a couple reasons. One, because you have to offer that legitimate path to people. But two, because in order to have some other kind of security force in place to keep those Hamas battalions from reforming, you have to have a political solution. You have to have a political path forward. So, for example, one of the possibilities is for the Palestinian Authority to offer policing and security on the ground with a trained-up force. Well, you have to have the PA operating in Gaza to be able to do that. And so you have to have some of the political path forward to achieve that. So we have made very clear that Israel's ultimate long-term security objectives can only be accomplished not just through a military campaign, but through some kind of political resolution with the Palestinians.
Or some version of it being a part of that political solution? If
No,
that's what the
absolutely not.
Palestinian-
Hamas is a brutal terrorist organization that committed terrorist acts long before October 7th, and then of course committed the heinous attacks on October 7th. So they do not have any right to political participation given the blood that continues to be on their hands.
I have a Pakistan question.
I'll come back to you, yeah. We finished Gaza. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Simple question. U.S. allowed Gaza ceasefire. What does it that mean for the war?
I'm sorry, what?
That U.S. allowed Gaza ceasefire. What does that mean for the war?
I don't know what you mean. The U.S. allowed a Gaza ceasefire.
That ceasefire in the UN resolution. You support it.
I spoke to that. I spoke to that earlier.
And yeah, can I have another question on Assistant Secretary of State Donald?
Let me come back to you. I just want to close out.
Thank you.
Israel. Rowdy Room's Day. Go ahead.
I want to go to the military aid. You've seen the reports that people drowned while trying to get to those aid, and previously the aid fell on the head of other people. There's still some difficulty in bringing convoys to the northern Gaza. Israelis still put on to ease this and prevent future incidents like that.
So I have seen the reports of people unfortunately drowning and unfortunately drowning in it. We have seen some improvement over the past few weeks. But there have been times before where we have seen an increase in the number of trucks going in on a daily basis, and that increase hasn't been sustained. It's fallen off for a variety of reasons, and so we want to see the increase. So anyone that says Hamas doesn't also bear some responsibility in the tragic situation and in the inability of aid to get into Israel is ignoring the reality on the ground and ignoring the fact that it was Hamas. We want to see that level continue to increase, and that's why we're going to continue to stay engaged.
Last one.
About the airdrops.
I have a last question.
Yeah.
Last one.
About the airdrops.
I have a last question.
Okay, we'll come back.
Just if any update on when the pier will be operational?
Like a human being, that around like 7,000 or more have been arrested from Israel or by Israel in West Bank and in Gaza. Some of them like humiliated.
A priority. Why some of them were killed? Why some of them were killed due to the Israeli bombing in different parts? There is no safety place, middle, north, south, and some were killed due to the hunger and threat.
You're kind of in a hurry.
Yeah, no, very busy. Okay, so has the United States been in touch with Sri Lanka and Singapore over the incident?
I'm not aware of any contacts with Sri Lanka. The U.S. Embassy Singapore has been in contact with Singapore's Maritime Port Authority, which has offered to provide. Go ahead.
Thank you, Matt. A few separate topics. Let me start with Evan Gershkovich. Today, Russian court extended his detention beyond 1 year until June, which one might argue that contradicts against even their own laws. Prosecutors are
who has been detained for 5 years as bargaining chips. They should be released immediately.
The point that you just made about
as bargaining chips, they should be released immediately.
The point that you just made about bargaining chips. Have you exhausted your options in terms of defending him? Have you exhausted your options in terms of defending him, getting him out?
By their continued aggression against Ukraine. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Matt. Last week, Assistant Secretary Donald Lu had stated that the U.S. is not in the favor of Pakistan starting work. Who were working in Pakistan were hit by a suicide car bomb. 5 of them have perished. Do you also have the
6 Supreme Court justices in Pakistan saying that they have been pressured, tortured, their families kind of abducted and pressured. 5
Secretary Blinken and President of the European Commission to be held on April 5. So what items are on the agenda? Is any?
And that we encourage the 2 partners to work together.
And second question about the energy issue, which Secretary Blinken mentioned that they will discuss this in
a commitment to hold terrorists in Afghanistan accountable, but we have also made clear to the Taliban that is Afghanistan accountable, but we have also made clear to the Taliban that is in their interest to counter violent terrorist groups inside Afghanistan.